What puts the idle in idle games? Idle games are an incredibly popular genre of game on any platform imaginable. They make perfect mobile games, as you only have to interact with them once or twice a day, and perfect PC games, as you can leave them on in the background while you're doing other things. But what does idle actually mean? Can we really measure if a game is more idle than others? Or can we determine what games are allowed to claim the idle title? According to a study presented at the 2015 International Games Media Conference, an idle game, also known as an incremental game, is a genre defined by the primary feature of its strategy, leaving the game running by itself with minimum or zero player interaction. Interaction with the game, while often useful for progression, is optional for extended periods of gameplay. The two big words you're going to be looking at are in the last sentence, often and optional. According to this study, if you were given an infinite amount of time, you should be able to complete an idle game with little to zero interaction. So let's talk about that for a second. Say there was an idle game about chopping wood. As you progress through the forest, the trees get more and more hit points. You start by manually punching trees, but can save up and buy a wooden axe for 50 wood that chops 5 wood a second passively. This usually is the general formula for any idle game. Heavy player interaction at the beginning to slowly give the player the rush that comes with passive progress. So let's go back to the thesis of this study. Does my hypothetical tree chopping game stand true as an idle game? Interaction with the game, while often useful for progression, is optional for extended periods of gameplay. Interaction with the tree game is only necessary at the very beginning, so the player can afford this wooden axe. And interaction would only be required if the player chooses to upgrade that axe to stone, iron, or diamond. However, the upgrades are completely optional. In my wood chopping game, the trees simply gain more HP. There is no time limit or DPS thresholds you must meet. Given an infinite amount of time, you could beat this game with minimum or zero player interaction. Ergo, interaction is optional for extended periods of gameplay. But this now begs the question, can you even beat an idle game? Usually by design, these games aren't meant to be beaten. There is an endless number of ways to slowly increase your outputs to infinity. So if you're given an infinite amount of time for a game that has no end, we're going to be stuck in a loop for all of time. Let's say, given an infinite amount of time, there's an infinite amount of progression to be had, not necessarily beating the game, but if you gave the player infinite time to idle in the game, could they progress to infinity without hitting any walls? A true idle game would operate around efficiency, rather than throwing walls at the player that force them to interact with the game. A game based around efficiency would coax the player into interacting with the game without necessarily making it mandatory. For example, if we look at my hypothetical tree game, in a true idle game fashion, there would be no tree that the player couldn't chop down with just a simple wooden axe. Yes, there would probably be some trees in the game that would take the player a full calendar year to break. However, it's still physically possible. Assuming interaction is optional, given an infinite amount of time, you could progress infinitely within this tree game. I would like to say there's one part of this thesis that I don't necessarily agree with the wording on. An idle game, also known as an incremental game. I think idle games generally are incremental games, that's true. However, I think it's an important distinction to make. Incremental games are not always idle games. In fact, that's what I hope to prove with this YouTube channel. There are lots of games out there that claim themselves as idle games. However, really, they are incremental games with very small idle components. I think there are quite a few games out there from my experience that are perfect reflections on what a true idle game should be. Contrastingly, I also think there are a lot of games out there that are fundamentally not idle games, but with the use of microtransactions, you gain the ability to turn the game into one. It's a similar story out there for the games that allow you to become truly idle after sinking hundreds or thousands of hours into the game. Just because you have the ability to idle in the game at some point, either after spending real money or playing for hundreds or thousands of hours, does not make it an idle game. That is an incremental game with an unlockable idle component. I think I would be remiss if I didn't talk about one of the most famous and pure embodiments of the idle game definition, Cookie Clicker. If you're watching this video, chances are you've played Cookie Clicker at least once in your life. Cookie Clicker, by definition, is a perfect example of what an idle game should be: efficiency over stagnation. Instead of throwing up walls to force a player to come back and manually interact with, in Cookie Clicker, you can buy the grandma and sit there with your computer open for 100 years and still make progress. The main focus of Cookie Clicker is the player's drive to improve efficiency. You want to come back, you want to improve, and you know you won't get stuck and stop making cookies all of a sudden. Interaction with Cookie Clicker, while often useful for progression, is completely optional for extended periods of gameplay. Now, understandably, for some people, clicking cookies might not be enough. They might want more content to progress through while idling. There are loads of idle games out there that'll satisfy that itch, and as I start my YouTube journey, I plan on bringing some of those hidden gems to light. Generally, when an idle game adds more content or a more satisfying endgame, the interactability level goes up. However, that's not necessarily always the case. You can have loads of content and endgame while still providing a basic idle experience. It just comes down to how it's implemented. Games either add this additional content optionally for a player to explore if they choose, or they add it forcefully and make the player interact with this extra content even if they don't want to. In summation, interaction with idle games, while often useful for progression, should always be optional for extended periods of gameplay. This goes without saying, but you should be able to idle in your idle games. You should be able to progress over an extended period of time and not come back to find out you got stuck after 2 levels and have been uselessly idling. That's how a large chunk of people quit idle games, when they find out idling isn't what the game's about. It's about forcing you to come back over and over, or else you will not progress. Some people really do enjoy a non-idle idle game. Hell, I do too. I made a YouTube channel exclusively for idle games because I love them so much. Not every idle game is going to be perfect, but I want to help this community and create transparent reviews on all the top idle games so you know what's worth your idle time. If you love idle games like I do, but constantly find yourself dropping them for a multitude of reasons, stick around and subscribe. Let me idle for you and answer the question, should you idle this game?